Hafrei Guam. Welcome back to the hotspot at the Boka Box. I'm Jess Rosario. I am the nutrition professional and owner here at the Boka Box, and we're still in school. And I wanted to take some time to talk to you guys about feeding your student athlete. Now, I'm a father of three, and two of my kids are athletes, and they play for their schools. My daughter, Lola, she plays rugby for Academy, and my son, Logan, he plays football, and he wrestles for Father Duenas. And I know how important it is as a parent to want your kids to succeed and to do good in their sport, but more importantly, I think it's very important that we teach our kids that once they start playing sports and once they start being physically active, they're on a whole different level. Now they have to not only do their schoolwork, they not only have to stay healthy, but they also have to eat in order to be fueled properly so that they can perform their sport in the right way. Now, when I start talking to my kids about eating to perform, and I put that in their head all the time because, they're high school kids. They're very self-conscious about the way that they look. And eating for looks and eating for performance are two separate and totally different things. And I try to drill into my kids' heads that eating to perform is the goal. Now, what does that mean? Well, as a student athlete, you don't want your kids to eat little, and because once they step on the court, once they step on the mat, once they step on the field, they need to have the energy and they need to be able to sustain their physical abilities so that they're performing at their optimum. And how do we do that? Well, I'm going to talk about things that they can do, things that you can do as parents to make sure that your kids stay very fueled the right way. We'll talk about timing, we'll talk about different types of food, we'll talk about hydration, and we'll talk about really what the goal is when it comes to student athletes. Now, once we start looking at eating right, when we start looking at our kids to eat right, we have to go back to the basics of nutrition. Now, for kids, and especially for athletes, they're in a whole different caliber. They're not regular students that go to school and that are studying and just going through their normal day. They have a busy schedule with practice and with games on the weekend and so forth. So they need more. They need more fuel and they need more food. So when I start to make the meals for my kids, I always make sure that, again, we go back to the basics, that they have carbohydrates, which we get from good sources of whole grain products, whether that's brown rice, quinoa, wheat breads, or even fast absorbing carbohydrates like white bread and white rice. I have that on their plates, as well as good amounts of protein. Now, you don't have to go overboard on the protein just because they're athletes. You need to give them an appropriate amount. And for me, I like to look at my kids' weights and do about 1 to 1.5 grams of protein per body weight. And, that can get very confusing with all the math and stuff. But just make sure that they have good amounts of protein on their plate, but it's not overwhelming for them. So carbs, proteins, make sure they got their vitamins and minerals from vegetables and fruit throughout the day, and make sure they have some sort of fat within their meals, whether that's salad dressings, whether that's a snack when they're eating maybe seeds and nuts, or they're getting it from vegetables like avocado, right? So we got to make sure that when they eat, they're very well balanced. Another thing that's very important, besides just making sure that they're eating very well balanced, is timing, right? Timing plays a big role in student athletes. You don't want to overfeed your kids. You don't want to underfeed your kids. I like to always look at my kids' schedules because it's very consistent, right? They go to school, then they have practice, and then they come home. So I tell my kids that the biggest meal that they should be eating is the meal they eat before practice. Now, that makes sense only because they're going to be taking in a lot of energy, and they're going to use up that energy for their performance. So I like to make sure that they're fueled for their performance, and afterwards, it's very important that they get something into their body as soon as possible. So we'll talk about supplements and things like that, but I like to make sure my kids get fueled and replenish their energy expenditure, whatever they expended throughout their practice, whether it's 2 hours or 3 hours. I want to make sure that they're eating and they're replenishing their protein, they're replenishing their carbohydrates. They're just eating after practice and they're not waiting too long. I like to stay within a 2-hour window, so I pick them up and either we'll get something to eat or I have something made for them already, and they just start replenishing and they start eating. Now, The way your student or the way your kids are going to eat is also based upon their sport and their gender and age and things like that. But sport plays a real important role. So for my daughter Lola, who plays rugby, I'm not too concerned about how much she's eating. If it's in excess, I just don't want her to eat too little. And sometimes I gotta force her because she's a girl, she's a sophomore, right? So she's very concerned about her body image. But I put her food, I make sure it's balanced, and I just make sure that she's eating enough before practice and especially after training sessions. For my son Logan, it's a little bit different story because he's wrestling and he needs to cut weight or maintain a certain weight. So if you're looking at meals for your student to cut weight and drop a little bit more weight, then we have to take another step more on portion sizes and making sure that they get the needed amounts of carbohydrates, that they get the needed amounts of proteins, and that they're not overeating. For me, timing plays a big role in that. I always make their biggest meal before practice, and then I'll kind of figure out where Logan's weight is and whether or not he can eat more than he needs to, or whether we need to pull back a little and just cut out the carbs or focus on just protein and salad and fruit and things like that. So keep that in mind. The way your kids are going to eat also is dependent upon the sport that they play, right? Aside from making sure that they're eating good before practice, I always like to make sure that they're eating maybe an hour before, so that they have something in the tank, before practice or even before the game. So I like to make things that are carbohydrate rich, that give them energy, but are also fast absorbing. So I'll do like peanut butter jelly sandwiches, which are easy to digest. I'll also do fruits like bananas or apples, just maybe one or two, depending on how hungry they are, just so that they have the fuel before they start practicing or before they get into the game. Now we have to talk about hydration. Hydration is very, very, very important. It's essential to what they're doing. Now, we all know that we live in a hot island, right? And we're gonna sweat. But these kids are sweating more than normal because they're just playing their sport and they're burning up a lot more energy. I like to make sure that my kids have water with them throughout the day, whether I give them a flask where they can fill up their water at school, but make sure that they're drinking water throughout the day, all day, because we don't want them to cramp up. We don't want them to get dehydrated. If they're playing high intensity sports, make sure they're kind of fueling up and drinking liquids every 20 to 30 minutes during practice. As coaches, that was something that, when I was going to school, when I was playing football, our coaches were very like, oh no, you're not drinking until an hour later or so forth. For me, that's a wrong mentality. You got to make sure that your athletes are very hydrated, so that nothing bad happens to their body. They're not cramping up and they're not getting dehydrated and run into further problems. So every 20 to 30 minutes, I like to make sure our athletes are very well hydrated. I make sure that my kids are hydrated. I give them a flask or I give them water bottles or whatever, so that it's readily accessible to them. If they're playing longer endurance sports, then things like Gatorade, Powerade, and whatever sports kind of drinks will come into play. And that's good because it helps them retain the water, helps them replenish electrolytes, and it just makes sure that they're not getting dehydrated. But also, one thing you need to consider when it comes to hydration is also salt loss. And if your kids are eating out a lot or whatever, they're getting a lot of salt in their body, but they're also losing a lot of salt because they're playing sports, right? So once you're buying sports drinks, make sure that there's some sodium inside of it so that they replenish the salt, which prevents cramping, which prevents dehydration. So stay hydrated throughout the day. 20 to 30 minutes throughout their practice or throughout their games or being hydrated. Make sure they have some sort of sports drink or salt within their body. Also, if you're going to take supplements, make sure that the supplements don't replace a meal. It's exactly what it's called, a supplement, to support and supplement the meal that they're eating. Just make sure that they're eating right and they're fueled enough for their sport. This is Jess from the Boka Box. If you have any questions about how to feed your student athlete, give me a call, come down. I have meal plans that are set up for student athletes, so we make sure that they're properly fueled. Again, come check me out in Agana at the Boka Box. This is Jess, and I'll see you next week on The Hot Spot.